All right, I want to welcome you to the last panel of today. I'm Julie Rose, and we will have one paper on the last panel from Steve Balakovic. And this panel is on the future of tyranny, for which the animating question was, what is the likely shape of the future of tyranny? Will it resemble the soft-despotism of Tocqueville? Will it be Orwellian political thought control, or some other form of unknown tyranny? And Steve's presenting a paper called Things Unseen on the Possibility of Democratic Despotism. And just to introduce Steve, he's a postdoctoral fellow at UCLA in the Department of Political Science, and he's also affiliated with UCLA's Center for Liberal Arts and Free Institutions, and he's the director of its new Commercial Republic project. Steve's the author of the recent book, Democracy Without Politics, which just came out in 2012. Which is a Tocquevillian reflection on how the quest for democratic equality can serve to undermine democratic politics. And before moving to UCLA, Steve has already taught at Yale, Harvard, and the University of Pittsburgh. So we're really happy to have him here today. Just a note about the format, since we only have one paper on this panel, Steve will speak for a little bit longer, 30, 35 minutes, however long you want, really. And then I'll provide, well, maybe, okay.
Take you up on that.
I'll provide some brief comments, and then we'll open it up to discussion on Steve's paper, but also a more wide-ranging, roundtable-type discussion on the future of tyranny, continuing the discussion that began at the end of the last panel with Russ's comments. So with that, I'll turn it over.
All right. Thank you all for coming out. Thanks for organizing and inviting this. I get to speak on the future of tyranny, so it's my favorite, just mindless speculation about whatever I want to talk about. I have quite a bit of time to talk, so I'll try to engage some of the comments that have been made earlier, address some of the things that we've covered a little bit already, and try to come full circle through past, present, and to the future. So really I want to focus on two closely related points in trying to think through the future of tyranny. The first is this idea of democratic despotism. We've heard about this quite a bit already today, this paradoxical connection between democracy, that is freedom in equality, and tyranny. So this is one of my major points I'll talk about, at least since Plato theorists have recognized this odd proximity of these two apparently polar opposite regimes. We would think of democracy and tyranny as opposites. For Plato, they were one baby step removed, and for many others, as we've already heard. He actually ends up writing in the Republic that too much freedom seems to change into nothing but too much slavery, both for the private man and the city. I think this captures this idea. Now, given our often proclaimed love of freedom and democracy, what do we value higher today than freedom and democracy? The most dangerous future form of tyranny, the most devilishly insidious, seductive, tempting tyranny, would be one that precisely uses this love against us. The tyranny that we most fear would be the tyranny that can work under cover of, and even use to its own purpose, our love of freedom and democracy. So we'll talk a lot about that. The second characteristic, the second thing I want to talk about is the characteristics of modern, or maybe what we should better call postmodern tyranny that we seem to fear most today. The first characteristic is, and this comes through in Tocqueville and many others, it's impersonal, unseen, even to an extent unfelt nature. This is what I call tyranny without tyrants. And we're going to want to ask, is this even possible? We can think from Caesar to Napoleon to Stalin to Mao to all of these different people we've heard. Who are our tyrants today? Who could we plausibly consider a tyrant? To say President George W. Bush or President Obama are tyrants, that invites laughter more than anything else. The Koch brothers, George Soros, I couldn't even think of a religious leader that I could plausibly put under this category. Even if you want to go abroad, Putin or different, it seems like a bit of a stretch to actually classify any of these along the lines of a Napoleon or a Caesar or these folks who would have been considered despotic, tyrannical, whether for better or for worse. And so we'll want to talk about this impersonal, abstract, unseen nature that comes up in the theorizations of modern and postmodern tyranny. And the second is what I'm going to call the psychology of servility. So the first point is this tyranny without tyrants. The second is this psychology of servility, that tyranny, if it is to arise in our time, will be rooted in our own desires. that we will, in some way, shape, or form, actually sell ourselves into slavery is the fear. And here we can think of this garlanded chains of Rousseau's happy slavery, what he calls happy slavery, the sort of critique that runs all the way back to at least Plato, through Kant, Mill, many others I'll mention today, through Tocqueville's seminal vision of mild and tutelary despotism, to Huxley's Brave New World, which is one of the great formulations of this, and to my favorite imagining, and I'm glad to see some people here who may actually know this reference, as to maybe some who won't, my favorite imagining of this future of tyranny, the spaceship in the children's movie WALL-E. If you've ever seen that, that's the perfect representation of the Brave New World, with its dull-eyed, obese people, controlled, supported, and taken care of by an unseen overseer of their own making, stuffing their faces, staring up entranced at these giant television screens in docile, joyless pleasure. I think, as well as anything, this captures our vision of what tyranny that we're verging on or tending toward would look like. All right, taking these two characteristics of tyranny together, we get the image of a sort of weightless, if you will, spiritual tyranny that colonizes the souls of individuals. It infiltrates us in some way by means of our own intellectual immaturity and our own material, physical needs and desires. We open the door to this tyranny. We invite it in some sense. Really what we get ultimately is the image of the human animal domesticated. I'll come back to this idea of a lot of domestication, that we are made subservient without leash or cage, that we internalize our own subservience, internalize our own oppression, and in some sense even welcome it. All right, let me start out with this juxtaposition of the tyranny envisioned by Orwell in 1984 and Huxley in his Brave New World. And I'm going to turn to Neil Postman, who really was the first to really flesh this juxtaposition out. He famously elaborated it in his classic social commentary, Amusing Ourselves to Death. It's a great book, interesting, prescient book. Orwell, Postman writes, quote, warns that we will be overcome by an externally imposed oppression, which relies upon the policing action, the policing of action and thought, the brainwashing of Big Brother and his agents. In Huxley's vision, on the other hand, no Big Brother is required to deprive people of their autonomy, maturity, and history. As Huxley saw, people will come to love their oppression, to adore the technologies that undo their capacities to think. Such oppression is less overwhelming than undermining. It operates less through suppression than degradation. It aims not to defeat our strengths, but to prey upon our weaknesses. It's based not primarily in prohibition, but in permission. Far from being constrained by the oppressed, far from being constrained, the oppressed are immediately granted their every felt desire. Postman writes, in 1984, people were controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they're controlled by inflicting pleasure. This may be a bit confusion. This actually sounds pretty good. Well, that's the whole point. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. Here again, let me give you a reference some of you may know. Huxley's tyranny is more the tyranny of, if any of you have seen the movie The Matrix, more so than something like Star Wars. In Star Wars, you have a target of resistance. In The Matrix, if you remember, this one character actually asked to be put back into the Matrix, asked for his own oppression, and he gave a reason. Why? Because he wanted a tasty steak. This is the idea. This is the idea of this servile domestication. All right, so what do we love ruinously today? What do we love so much that we will happily submit to a sort of servitude? What do we adore without thinking and against our capacity for thought? In Huxley, Postman, WALL-E, The Matrix, this model of hedonistic tyranny, this is the key question. What is it that we love that can be turned against us in this fashion? Now, on Postman's account, which I'll talk a little bit about here, what we love above all and perhaps exclusively is the narcissistic, visceral pleasure derived from a certain form of entertainment most closely associated with music and images, orchestrated in an immediately accessible, intellectually predigested, ego-massaging, emotion-stirring narrative. That's a long way of saying we love television. What we love above all is television, along with any other screen image response stimuli device. We are oppressed in turn, like Pavlov's dogs were oppressed by the dinner bell. That's the model of oppression here. Conditioning and control come to seem like freedom when freedom seems like desire fulfillment. Pavlov's dogs got exactly what they wanted, and they were entirely controlled. The scale model of this domination here, Postman writes, is not the gray, walled-up city of Soviet-occupied East Germany, but rather the excessively permissive, blindingly colorful dream cities of Las Vegas and Hollywood. And here, if you've read The Republic, you can think of Plato's initial description of democracy as a many-colored cloak. This vibrancy actually is integral to this form of oppression. Now, when these, Las Vegas and Hollywood, become our aspirational homelands, when we are devoted to the orthodoxy and orthopraxy of entertainment in a society that worships television, Postman writes, when our existence is so flattened and we have so sunk below the level of humanity, the circle is closed and our oppression becomes self-sufficient and self-perpetuating. We are so domesticated we no longer need tyrants to control us. Beyond resistance, beyond futile, resistance becomes incomprehensible. We barely register that we're being oppressed, if at all. That which should be our highest, our sources of devotion and worship, has been consumed by that which is lowest. Modernity's democratic promise of popular self-government has given way to the modern democratic promise of popular self-gratification. This is the fear. Here, oppression operates unseen through seduction rather than repression. Indeed, in part through the taboo against repression and inhibition. Think of any time you ever go to Las Vegas, if you've ever been to Las Vegas, and what's this phrase, what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. The whole idea of the city is to have this taboo against any inhibitions. Censorship is unnecessary in this model of tyranny because no one pays attention to or even says anything worth being censored. Indeed, the prohibition of censorship supplements the Las Vegas brand of oppression. Books need not be burned because nobody cares to read books, especially books that would deserve to be burned. Understanding that permission rather than repression is the finest tool of the tyrant. When his subjects can be reduced to entertaining nothing but their base desires, was among the central lessons to be learned by Hobbes's Leviathan, and was probably most fully formulated, as was mentioned earlier, in Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man and a whole series of other books he wrote, which are hardly ever read anymore. Hugely popular at the time, but neglected today. All right, so this notion of oppression through distraction, amusement, and trivialization, the trivialization of everything, is so unsettling, again, precisely because it proceeds without question, protest, or even much notice. It catches us sleeping or celebrating. There's no apparent power at work, no need for violence, and so it presents no target for protest or resistance or heroic struggle. The hallmark of this tyranny is not terror or brutality, not rape or executions, which we talked about earlier, but laughter. Oddly, and we have to think this through, laughter, celebration, rejoicing is the hallmark of this form of tyranny. Postman concludes that our, quote, consuming love affair with television appears benign when it's not invisible altogether, but it's an ideology nonetheless, for it imposes a way of life, a set of relations among people and ideas about which there has been no consensus, no discussion, and no opposition, only compliance. So vast is its power that the power goes unnoticed. our situation becomes quite apparently like Plato's cave in the Republic, the inhabitants of which grow so habituated to their shadowy and constrained condition that they affirm it as true and good. They don't even recognize that they're enchained. No reader of Plato's Republic can fail to notice the similarity between the architecture of the cave and that of our living rooms. Prison culture by means not censorship or surveillance, but totalizing fantasy. We are oppressed not by those who watch us. We talked a little bit about surveillance earlier. We're oppressed not by those who watch us, but by what we watch. The addictive, manipulative, stultifying image. This is Postman's vision of the future of tyranny. Now, this critique he offers resonates even more so today with the technological revolutions that have, it seems, cast all in television's image. I think if Postman were alive today, he'd be pretty unhappy. His cogent social commentary now sounds like chilling prophecy as the amusing image has gone viral, insinuating its way into our every waking hour. All the world's a screen and all the men and women viewers. What reflects the regrettable course of our culture back to us better than the familiar images of the iPod zombie, the internet junkie, the video game besotted, this mythical creature we see wandering around with the body of a man and the head of a smartphone? This is Postman's critique gone haywire. Again, it's even much more disconcerting than it would have been in his time. When we criticize our culture, it's perhaps most often by reference to these screen idols. To point out their pervasive and perverse influence is by now less an insight than a cliche. I doubt anything I've said to this point strikes anybody as new or novel. This is actually an important point I want to come back to in my conclusion. Who hasn't heard parodied these monuments to docile narcissism that are YouTube and Facebook? How many of you have spent, let's say, 5 hours in the last week on YouTube? Really, hardly anybody. What about Twitter? How many people have sent out a Twitter today? A couple people. A little guilty. Anybody on this side of the room? There's really this perfect whoosh on the two sides of the room. How many people have a Facebook account? How many people have a well-kept-up Facebook account? And why do you laugh about it? We'll come back to that toward the end. That's actually an important point. That's a crucial point. Nobody shot their hand up. Right here, Facebook junkie, didn't happen. So we constantly accuse ourselves of being reduced to servility and softness by the endless stream of junk we consume, whether the junk food that softens our waistlines, and believe me, I'm packed full of cookies from lunch right now, to the junk food entertainment that softens our wills and our minds. Postman's analysis and our current situation leave us to wonder whether Huxley actually didn't go far enough in his critique in Brave New World. It seems a little timid by our standards today. All right, so why is this Brave New World image of tyranny so hauntingly resonant and ubiquitous today? The answer, I think, lies in the fact that we live in a democratic age and that there's long been recognized this uncanny proximity of democracy and tyranny. This argument was perhaps best, if not first, elaborated by Plato in his Republic. I just want to walk through the logic of this very quickly, and this is key. How do we get from what seems like total and unfettered freedom to what is total oppressive tyranny? It's actually, like I say, a very short step. It doesn't take long to explain. The democratic regime is principled upon equality, and its highest good is the freedom to be found in equality. That is, the freedom found in the absence of higher authorities. This is the freedom of the democratic regime. Now, taken to excess, this freedom in equality demands the dissolution of all hierarchies and of authority as such. Well, virtue, we can think of, first of all, is an essentially hierarchical concept. It's based upon a sense of higher and lower, inferior and superior, base and noble. It makes no sense to talk about virtue outside of the context of hierarchy. It's an essentially hierarchical concept. In fact, the very notion of judgment of human judgment relies upon hierarchy, differentiating higher and lower. You can't have judgment without hierarchy. And law, other than the law of the jungle, is premised upon the recognition of some authority. All right, so democratic freedom inequality, in its unalloyed form at least, takes shape in the exiling, and this is precisely Plato's argument, in the exiling of virtue and judgment and law from both the soul and the city. This is the freedom of what he calls licentiousness. Or put differently, this is the freedom of the teenager whose parents have left town for the weekend and they're at home alone. I won't even ask the question of if you've lived this, most of us have, it's pretty cliche, where your parents go away for the weekend and say, oh, don't have any parties, don't have anybody over. Well, the parental authority has departed and you are free to do what you desire. Licentiousness, absent virtue, law, and, well, probably judgment. With the rejection of higher and lower, the sole remaining standard of judgment becomes that of more or less. So higher and lower is replaced by more and less, and the only thing it makes sense to want more of is whatever the body happens to desire. The easier the pleasure, the better. The high demands of the soul, or we can say the conscience, to put it in a little bit later terms, are ignored, and the vulgar desires of the body are indulged to the extent that one's powers permit. Ultimately, the desires of the body know no limits. The human animal is reduced to a sort of gluttonous and tyrannical beast. Or as Plato puts it, the human being becomes a slave to his desires. Getting what you desire, when desire knows no limits, easily turns into becoming a slave to one's own desires or the desires of others. In other words, he becomes an addict. To the soma of Huxley's Brave New World or the image stimulant of Postman's TV dystopia or any of these other examples, the individual, the human being, becomes servile before the immoderate pleasure center of his own brain. An addict. You've probably all experienced this in some way, shape, or form. There's a plate of broccoli and there's the chocolate cake. And which are you going to eat? You know which one you should eat. Judgment actually is still in some sort of operation. It tells you what's good for you, what you should eat. You eat the cake, and you probably eat the cake to immoderate extremes, and maybe afterward you even feel like, well, a little bit of a loss of control there, loss of desire control. And so ultimately, as Plato writes, too much freedom, this is what he means by too much freedom, freedom without the constraints of virtue or law or judgment. Too much freedom seems to change into nothing but too much slavery, both for the private man and the city. This is why democracy is one small little step from tyranny. The inhabitants of the democratic regime are enslaved precisely by the means of that which they love. They love freedom above all, and that becomes the instrument of their own oppression. The defect of authority, to put this in Aristotelian terms, the defect of authority and the excess of power go hand in hand. The exiling of authority from the city isn't the same as the exiling of power. In fact, it's the unleashing, the liberating of power. And the democratic soul and city come to resemble a Hobbesian state of nature, a state to which there's really only one final solution or way out, and that's tyranny. All right, so we've done the past, now let's come to the present and looking forward to the future. And here I want to talk about Tocqueville. Nobody's better talking about this than Tocqueville and rethinking, retheorizing this notion of tyranny in modern terms. The modern innovation of this democratic despotism, which is most fully theorized by Tocqueville, when he describes this radicalization of the psychology of servility that takes place in not so much democratic society, but mass democratic society. We'll talk about this in a second. And who understands modern tyranny as capable of proceeding exactly without tyrants. There's no, for all of the lack of freedom, loss of freedom, tyranny, oppression in Tocqueville, there's no tyrant. He seldom, if ever, talks about a Napoleon or a Caesar or anybody else. And if so, only to differentiate it from this modern or eventually postmodern rising form of tyranny. This is an unseen and unfelt, abstract and impersonal tyranny he associates first with this. He has 2 volumes of Democracy in America, and in the first one he focuses primarily on this peer-pressured gravity of public opinion. There have been these experiments where you're in a room of 50 people and everyone's in on it except one, and they show a blue light, and 49 people, they know what it is, but they're paid, and they say they see red, and the one remaining person in the room says, I guess it's red. Actually starts to doubt the color that they've seen. This is the sort of gravity of public opinion, the peer pressure, where you start to doubt your own perceptions, your own senses. This has been maybe most famously theorized by Mill in his view of social tyranny. And in the second volume of Democracy in America, Tocqueville turns to, I think, what most of us would consider a more troubling view of what he calls a mild and tutelary despotism, of the centralized but administratively extensive, bureaucratic, socialistic state. This is, if you will, his mature vision of the future of tyranny in a democratic society. This peer pressure of majority opinion is still present, but is pushed a little bit to the side. In a now familiar argument that he pioneered, Tocqueville analyzes the advance of despotism in terms of what he calls the creep of administrative centralization. Here, power concentrates in the organs of the popularly elected state. So it's a democratic state. It's a representative government. And the state projects this power to plan, oversee, and regulate most every sphere of human activity. All the world is in turn represented as a system, a mechanical organization of complex but quantifiable materials and forces, which operates, if properly managed, predictably and efficiently according to design. The whole world is rationalized and bureaucratized. Indeed, once we think and talk in terms of systems, the economic system, the political system, we're well down the road to centralization and managerial administration. If you think of the world or aspects of it, politics, economics, in terms of a system, this actually moves you down toward Tocqueville's fear of administrative centralization. Human cultures are abstracted into a society, which is a modern term, of homogeneous, disconnected, but interdependent and ultimately uniform individuals. Society becomes a mass market. And the consequent empire of soulless bureaucracy, which we've heard a lot about already, individual initiative and the human spirit wither. A totalizing network of standardized rules and regulations enables the centralized oversight of the demographied nation, and simultaneously suffocates personal responsibility and self-government, things that Tocqueville identifies with liberty, as opposed to licentiousness. The prospect of democratic despotism is all the more troubling in Tocqueville's eyes, not only because it's impersonal and abstract in the way we just laid out, but also because its promise is so tempting. It's such a temptation to modern democratic peoples. And this is really what the bulk of Democracy in America is devoted to, that in the egalitarian mass of anonymous mediocrity, where the experience of individual insignificance, of being lost in the crowd, as Tocqueville often says, of innumerable similar others, is all but inevitable, we the people may well abdicate our newfound sovereignty, forsake our rights and responsibilities, and invite our own superintendence. Let me ask you a question. Why would you possibly vote in an election when your vote means exactly nothing? It's totally without effect. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I doubt there's ever been an election determined by one single vote. You can vote, you cannot vote. It makes no difference. This sort of logic is exactly what Tocqueville feared when you become one minuscule, indistinguishable drop from hundreds, thousands, and millions of others. You feel powerless. Your vote literally is without power. The individual may come to feel powerless, unable not only to make a difference in the world, but moreover to even understand the societal and historical tides that buffet his own existence. Think of how often we're described as helpless before the forces of globalization. It's this sort of process that operates beyond not only our control, but even our understanding, and our daily lives are so integrally shaped by this. Whether or not you're going to get a job upon graduation probably is determined in large part upon these forces of globalization and how it shapes the job market. Adrift and submerged, he casts off all things demanding or higher and turns his attention to his own most immediate material needs and desires. Security, comfort, and pleasure. That ends up being the only things that we ultimately really desire. Security, comfort, and pleasure. The inhabitants of democratic society end up in the terrible position of being totally self-centered, but without the resources for self-respect. All they look upon are themselves, and what they see they don't like. In there, what Tocqueville calls excessive humility, to use a term he comes back to again and again, such a prostrate, infantilized people happily falls into, gives themselves to a new paternal, or the better way to put it would be maternal state, the nanny state, as long as it doesn't shock their egalitarian sensibilities. This vast, impersonal, and so not overtly aristocratic or inegalitarian power that relieves people of the burdens of thinking and acting for themselves and promises to take care of them. This is what we may, Tocqueville is afraid, actually search out. We may want to give ourselves up to this. The outcome is the soul's degradation and the spirit's enervation. We become soft, weak, docile. Along these lines, democratic despotism strikes at the very roots of human pride and dignity, culminating in no less than a sort of brave new world dystopia of a domesticated humanity. Tocqueville says again and again, talks about us falling below the level of humanity. Well, this is what he's afraid of. I'm going to quote at some length this passage, even though it's already been quoted, because it really captures so much of what we've been talking about. This is toward the end of the second volume of Democracy in America. In a chapter he calls What Kind of Despotism Democratic Nations Have to Fear. And so I want to point out that this isn't something Tocqueville sees as in existence or necessarily even predicts. But if there is to be a despotism in democracy's future, this is what it's going to sound like. He says, I'm trying to imagine. So again, this is nothing he sees, but something he imagines, and which is so different from previous modern and pre-modern forms of tyranny that he struggles to imagine. I'm trying to imagine what new features despotism might have in today's world. I see an innumerable host of men, all alike and equal, endlessly hastening after petty and vulgar pleasures with which they fill their souls. This is the psychology of servility. You're endlessly hastening after these petty and vulgar pleasures, and that's all you think about. Each of them, drawn into himself, is virtually a stranger to the fate of all others. Over these men stands an immense tutelary power. And now listen here to the abstract language he uses, which he's going to quickly abandon. An immense tutelary power, which assumes sole responsibility for securing their pleasures and watching over their fate. This power is absolute, meticulous, regular, provident, and mild. It doesn't brutalize, it doesn't shock, it's a mild despotism. He says it would resemble paternal authority if only its purpose were the same, namely to prepare men for manhood. But on the contrary, it seeks only to keep them in childhood irrevocably. This sort of infantilization is another way to put this. It likes citizens to rejoice, and this is perfect Brave New World. It likes citizens to rejoice, provided they think only of rejoicing. It provides for their security, foresees and takes care of their needs, facilitates their pleasures, manages their most important affairs, and directs their industry. Equality paved the way for all these things by preparing men to put up with them and even look upon them as a boon. This is the tyranny that we love. The sovereign, after taking individuals one by one in his, and now we have a personalized language, Tocqueville switches to taking them into his powerful hands and kneading them to his liking. So now there's a he involved. But Tocqueville never explicates this, never lays out what this he is. I actually think he's going against his own interpretation by invoking a language of his and he and hands, these sorts of things. He reaches out to embrace society as a whole. Over it, he spreads a fine mesh of uniform, minute, and complex rules through which not even the most original minds and vigorous souls can poke their heads above the crowd. He does not break men's wills, but softens, bends, and guides them. He seldom forces anyone to act, but he constantly opposes action. Rather than tyrannize, he inhibits, represses, saps, stifles, and stultifies. And in the end, and this is probably the most famous line in democracy in America, he reduces each nation to nothing but a flock of timid and industrious animals with the government as its shepherd. I think that's probably the finest formulation of this tyranny that we today most fear. All right, I'm going to skip over a little bit of Wolin and Laforce since I'm running out of time. I'll just skip to the conclusion. I don't know if you were going to talk about.
I was, but
Nah.
I will fill in.
You'll probably say it better than I would have anyways. All right, so what is this future of tyranny? Was Tocqueville on the right track as he struggled to envision this? Has this come to pass? Are we actually moving in some way beyond what Tocqueville envisioned? Well, let me leave on the same optimistic note with which Tocqueville departed America. Again, Tocqueville said this sort of despotism may come to pass, not that it's likely to or is just about to. After laying out his vision of democratic despotism, Tocqueville writes that I feel ever more assured in my belief that in order to be virtuous and prosperous, democratic nations only have to want to be so. It's within their power to decide whether equality will lead them to servitude or liberty. All we need to do is maintain our, what he calls, manly vigilance against servility and tyranny. So literally, to avoid tyranny, all we have to do is wish it so. It's in some sense, after this very bleak picture he's laid out, a shockingly optimistic note. Well, today the warning issued by Tocqueville and Huxley and Postman resonate far and wide. Every first-time reader of Tocqueville or Postman, say they were right on track. Boy, did they get it right. Their prescient visions haunt us, chill us in their apparent accuracy. We seem ever more the domesticated creatures of a tutelary despotism. We've heard about this already today, subject to a vast impersonal conspiracy against our freedom. But let me ask, would Tocqueville's warning still resonate so loudly and widely were we so domesticated? The satisfied and docile herd subjects of tutelary despotism wouldn't flock to celebrate and quote Tocqueville's passages on such despotism. Tocqueville's passage has already been quoted twice today. The inhabitants of the brave new world wouldn't recognize that world as dystopian. Everyone who argues that we are living in this brave new world and complains about it has to recognize that, with the exception of two characters who are different in a way, nobody within the brave new world recognizes that brave new world as dystopian. The very fact that we still recognize it as such attests possibly to the fact of what Tocqueville called maintaining our vigilance against it. Relieved of the troubles of thinking, these inhabitants of the brave new world wouldn't condemn their own softness or form mass political parties to decry the nanny state, socialism to defend their civil rights and liberties and so forth. Postman's book, his book Amusing Ourselves to Death, wouldn't be a bestseller. Nobody would have bought it, much less read it in the brave new world. His book's now been translated into multiple languages, onto numerous printings, and as we talked about with Wally, it's become the moral of a children's movie. Maybe some of this attests to the fact that we haven't succumbed to this psychology of servility quite to the degree that we may fear. In fact, the very fact that we fear it attests to that fact. There would be neither the disposition of nor a target for resistance if these predictions had come to pass. Contra Postman, and this goes back to what we were talking about, who isn't proud to announce that I don't watch television, or I don't even know anything about this Twitter and Facebook, and I don't have anything to do with it. TV and Twitter and Facebook and these things may be pleasures, but they're guilty ones. They're ones we laugh at as we admit. And that maybe, you can question this, may make all the difference. Tellingly, Postman writes, an Orwellian world is much easier to recognize, to oppose, than a Huxleyan. We take arms against an Orwellian sea of troubles buttressed by the spirit of Milton, Bacon, Voltaire, Goethe, and Jefferson. Who's prepared to take arms against a sea of amusements? I fear that our philosophers have given us no guidance in this matter. Well, as I've tried to mention throughout this paper, this tradition in philosophy seems at least as prominent and includes Plato, Augustine, Rousseau, Kant, Mill, Marx, Nietzsche, Marcuse, and not to mention many of the folks who are here today. Thanks.
No, that's okay. I'll give it to you. Okay, great. So, well, first, I want to thank Steve for the paper, which was really excellent, and to say that the paper itself mostly focused on Tocqueville and Lefort and Sheldon Wollen's accounts of the future of tyranny, and the opening material was more drawn from Steve's book. So, in addition to reading the paper, I recommend the book to you all as well. And so I'll focus less so on the opening material and more on the analyses of Tocqueville, and then I'll present some of the analysis of Wollen, which some of you might be familiar with anyway, and give some comments on that as well. But just to the opening parts about Postman and the TV dystopia, in general, I find that there's reason to be more optimistic. I don't know if anyone's ever been to Las Vegas and decided that it's a good idea to stay for more than 72 hours. It seems like we all have an upper limit for how much of that we can take. But anyway, I just wanted to say that the paper is really ideal for this panel since it provides a lot of questions and prompts a lot of speculation, and not mindless speculation, but mindful speculation about the future of tyranny. And so my comments today are not really quarreling with your interpretations or really directly suggesting revisions to the paper, but are more in the spirit of the paper itself, prompting further questions and ideas for more discussion. So the paper, as I said, goes through its analyses of Tocqueville and Lefort and Sheldon Wollen, and I'll just focus on the analyses of Tocqueville and Wollen. And so in the paper, Steve suggests that both Tocqueville and Wollen give us reason to be pessimistic about the possibility, that tyranny will emerge out of democracy, and that out of our modern democracy we'll have some sort of tyranny. And I want to suggest to both of the accounts two different ways of looking at it, or two alternatives that suggest reasons to perhaps be more optimistic than either Tocqueville, or especially Tocqueville's modern followers, allow, or than Wollen allows, and a different source of optimism than the kind of optimism that Steve suggested at the end of his remarks. So that will be kind of the general thrust of my comments, are, not to worry so much. Okay. So first, for Tocqueville, the primary fear is really that there is this regulatory welfare state, and that the welfare state controls our lives without our realizing it and coddles us so that we, on the one hand, are no longer capable of handling difficulty, that we're averse to suffering and risk, and that on the other hand, we seek only and are satisfied entirely by material comforts. So to this fear, the first distinction that I want to make is that this account collapses two, I think, rather different accounts of the welfare state generally. So one form of each of these welfare states share a commitment to equality, but they're two very different models. So the first, which is the feared model, aims primarily to sate citizens' basic needs and to satisfy their preferences. So it's primarily aimed at needs satisfaction. But there's a second model of the welfare state, which is that its primary goal is to enhance citizens' freedoms and to enhance their capabilities. And so the first could be conceived plausibly as a form of state maternalism, as a sort of nanny state. Its commitment to needs and preference satisfaction would guarantee all citizens ample nutrition, housing, health care, satisfying occupations, and recreation. It would provide citizens with security and protection against misfortune. It would regulate risky behaviors given that they're socially expensive. And given all of those different things, it might then plausibly be conceived as a nanny state. It would meet all needs and amply regulate behavior. But there's an alternative vision of the welfare state, which I think could be much less readily conceived as a micromanaging, coddling nanny state. So this alternative picture of the welfare state instead aims to provide citizens with the material resources that they require in order to exercise their liberties and to pursue their opportunities. And it provides them with the resources to do those things on their own initiative. It doesn't provide them with need satisfaction directly. So it does guarantee that citizens don't fall below a certain level of deprivation, but it accepts some risk as attendant to free action. And so on this model, citizens are provided with resources not to satisfy their material needs, but that so they can pursue their own projects and pursue their own ambitions with the difficulties and the suffering and the risk that that involves. And I think that this alternative model of the welfare state is actually what I'd wager most Americans, both on the left and on the right, actually support. And given that, I think at least within the United States, there's less reason to fear the rise of this kind of tutelary nanny state, and that the existence of a welfare state in itself is not proof that we are on the road to servitude. And I'd just say that even among theorists of distributive justice, which is a relatively rarefied academic lefty world, it's the second model of the welfare state that is the one that's supported, the freedom-enhancing rather than need-satisfying model. So that's one reason to be more optimistic about the future. And so second, what Steve didn't have a chance to get to today, but in the paper he discusses Sheldon Wollin's recent work on the rise of the superpower of the economic sphere. And so Sheldon Wollin fears that already we have experienced the economization of life. So the economic impulse is the primary drive. Markets have spread into every domain. We observe privatization of all of these areas that were previously immune from market reasoning and market analysis. That markets have become so powerful that they can no longer be controlled by the state. And so it's the end of political authority and the rise of economic authority. And so Wollin describes this as the inverted totalitarianism of the economy as a form of economic totalitarianism. And again, Wollin is very pessimistic and thinks that already this has emerged and will only increase in the future. And so this is an alternative picture of the danger of totalitarianism that can emerge out of democracy. And again, I'd like to suggest a distinction or an alternative way of looking at this that might challenge that kind of pessimism and provide us with more reason for optimism. And so we might observe that there is this fair degree of privatization and the ascendancy of markets, but I'd suggest that that in itself is an evidence that the economic impulse has become all-powerful, or that it's the thing that now controls us. Instead, we might think of markets as an instrument, a way to efficiently realize social aims that we have made a political decision to rely upon, and that we rely upon markets at our own discretion. And so long as we maintain the ability to regulate and to direct and to curtail markets, then we aren't, in fact, under the control of markets, but are still the agents of control over those markets. And there is, perhaps in the United States anyway, evidence that we aren't doing enough of that, but still maintaining some degree of ability to constrain markets, to regulate them, to direct them to social goals, and to rely upon them as instruments. And so the very fact that we observe the spread of market thinking and the spread of privatization is not evidence that we have become controlled by the economic and that the political has been neutered, as it were. So anyway, just to close, I think that both of these distinctions provide us with ways to think about what the prospects are for the rise of tyranny or totalitarianism are out of democracy, and that we can take the analyses of both Tocqueville and Wollin and question them and see if there might be more reason for optimism than for pessimism looking at the future, in addition to the reasons that Steve himself suggested about why we ought to be optimistic that domesticated animals would not observe their own domestication and decry it. That would be beyond their abilities. So anyway, I want to thank Steve for his excellent paper, and we'll open it up to a really wide-ranging discussion, hopefully. Great, thanks.
There is one comment Tocqueville makes that suggests perhaps Tocquevillian remedy or a Tocquevillian basis for optimism for the soft despotism. And that's Tocqueville's sort of funny comment that other people have echoed after him. Tocqueville always says, America is a nation oriented toward the pursuit of happiness. He says, but I've never seen a more joyless people than the Americans. They're pursuing happiness, and boy, are they serious about it, you know. So I think what he's reflecting there is that these pleasures, you referred to television or Twitter or Facebook or Las Vegas, these kind of things, because those aren't truly deep and lasting sources of joy or happiness, people do get bored and frustrated with them. They realize that they're joyless. And, and now psychologists are doing all these studies showing that, Facebook makes you unhappy, and, internet dating makes you unhappy, and all these things that are meant that they're supposed to give us pleasure and so on, and relieve our boredom, actually make us more bored and more frustrated and less happy. So I think there's kind of a learning curve, and that people can form different desires about their desires. They can form second-order desires that they want to avoid some of these kinds of pleasures. So I think as we discover that many things we take to be part of the pursuit of happiness really are joyless, that we'll start to emancipate ourselves from them.
Yeah, that's famously part of Tocqueville's celebration of America, is saying that maybe a bit as opposed to the French, the Americans aren't so subsumed in this banal bourgeois pursuit of material pleasures. In fact, in pursuing wealth, they're actually engaging in a sort of war and risk-taking, and they'll build a house today and abandon it tomorrow for future. And really, they love the gamble more than the gain. They love the risk-taking more than the reward. And then the reward today is just abandoned tomorrow, and they continue to strive in almost a sort of heroic struggle they integrate into their economic lives. And that's exactly what he says about Americans, and why he says they're maybe a little bit defended against this creeping tutelary despotism.
This is for Steve. I wonder if you're not too optimistic.
Always.
The reason that I have in mind is this. Yes, indeed, in Democracy in America, Tocqueville's tyranny is without a tyrant. And there's no examination of the motive of the tyrant. But he did also write on the French Revolution. And in the material that was not published in his lifetime, but that came out later, he talks at some length about Napoleon. He grew up under Napoleon, and I think reflected deeply on the phenomenon that was Napoleon. See, I wonder whether this softening, Tocqueville's vision of what man could become is more or less Nietzsche's vision of the last man. Very simple. His little pleasure in the morning and his little pleasure in the evening, and nothing else. But that doesn't mean there won't be spirited men. And Russ mentioned this sort of modern tyranny is a tyranny without eros. But that's true in theory. If you think of the cult of personality, Stalin, Lenin, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, Pol Pot, Fidel Castro were erotic and spirited in the sense that they wanted to be the one. The Hobbesian sovereign is depicted by Hobbes also in the way Tocqueville depicts the Tocquevillian tyrant, which is that he's not depicted at all.
No.
But if you look sort of carefully, the Hobbesian sovereign is in the state of nature. And Hobbes tells you that in the state of nature, the two virtues are force and fraud. So he picks that up right out of Machiavelli's Prince. It strikes me that it would be very easy to combine a society dominated by soft despotic propensities of the very sort that you're talking about, with the cult of personality and with the Messiah politician, who is the great provider of everything that you could possibly want. And the thing that he would provide you most with is the empty freedom that Julie spoke about. That is to say, the welfare state liberates you so that you are free. Free from needs, so you're free for your own projects. Facebook, Twitter, TV, movies. See, I wonder, freedom for what? And where does this freedom go, if not in the direction that Neil Postman lays out, amusing ourselves? I don't get the sense that the freedom provided by the welfare state to single mothers, for example, through WIC and then through food stamps, actually leads to these great projects that are the expression of our freedom as citizens. It seems to me it leads to meth and similar things. I live in the countryside, so
Well,
that's the story.
there's a lot there to respond to, and maybe a lot I would disagree with. I think you're right that as Tocqueville gets older, he actually gets much more pessimistic, to the point of, by the time he's writing his recollections, it's just bleak. I mean, then he's focused primarily on France. But again, for Tocqueville, the more dangerous despotism is the one that's not personified. The personification of the tyrant provides a target for resistance. Shocks our egalitarian sensibilities, even if that person is popularly elected, and Tocqueville recognizes this too, and paves the way for a sort of heroic struggle. And so we ask our government to provide everything for us today, and we complain about everything the government does. The government acts, we protest. The government, you can go on and on like this. I ended up leaving out the Claude Lafleur part. This is sort of his argument. The more the political power is given form, whether in a person or an institution, the less dangerous that tyranny becomes, because the more it presents a target. The less is it impersonal and abstract, working upon us without our feeling it, first of all. The Hobbesian sovereign, I think you're exactly right. You almost wonder if the tyrant even wants to be the tyrant. There's no eros, there's no drive, there doesn't seem to be any passion. You almost wonder if this person isn't just picked and regrets it in some sense. And does that make it less of a dangerous sort of tyranny? There doesn't seem to be this will to dominate for the Leviathan, even if there was a need to dominate. The welfare state, I guess I would just say along these lines, what would be in principle difference between the welfare state that provides food stamps or the different and the welfare state that provides for education, free public education? The idea is the same. And so if you're going to complain about the Affordable Care Act today, go back and read the criticisms of Social Security and, of course, the criticisms of public education all the way. But now you may consider this a creeping, every sphere of life is being colonized. The government is, bureaucratic, standardized testing has become the hallmark of every educational reform, and Tocqueville certainly would not like that shift away from localism to centralized power. But at the same time, if you're going to say we become dependent upon the government for health care, or dependent upon the government for food, we are dependent upon the government for education. And we have been for 120, 30 years now. And so if you're going to criticize these modern reforms as creating dependencies, you would want to criticize these previous reforms as creating dependencies, but I think many of us would be much more prone to say, well, free public education actually, exactly as you say, elevates us out of need and dependence and enables us to, maybe some of us go on Facebook and some of us go on Twitter, but there have probably been hundreds of millions of hours spent reading Neil Postman's book, or any of these, or Shakespeare, or any of these million other things we can point out. I've heard that it's interesting. Well, I won't get into it any further, but this has been a topic that's come up a lot this morning and during lunch, about this sort of turning away from intellectual life and culture and toward these sheer vulgar pleasures. And I'm always so dubious when this is mentioned. This is would be an impossible thing to prove, but it strikes me in my time as a teacher as not capturing the youth of today at all. But maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm hopelessly naive and optimistic to come full circle.
So thanks very much. I want to be optimistic, the way we're both optimistic. And it seems to me that the sources of optimism that you identify depend on a conception of political agency in which we can sort of think ourselves out of this drift or something of the sort. And I just wondered how you would respond to, say, a Foucauldian critique of the possibility of agency when we exist in a kind of, in a particular regime of knowledge where different kinds of power, biopower, and so on, are being exerted on us. So that, the idea is that every time we try to think ourselves out of these well-worn pathways, that the new story that we think we're coming up with is always already, written for us. So what would you
Well,
say?
interestingly, again, you'd have to wonder if his writing itself isn't a performative contradiction, and the popularity of his writing doesn't, to some degree, disprove what he's saying. But having said all of that, I think that would be like complaining, yeah, every society you live in, every civilization, every culture acculturates you. Every regime standardizes you to some extent to that regime form. His insight only seems to go that far, and that you are raised with certain, values and certain dispositions and certain habits and certain characteristics, many of which go unrecognized. But has that ever not been the case? Is it possible for that to not be the case? It would be like complaining that I'm oppressed by gravity.
Well, certainly Foucault would say it's not always been the case in the sense that it's a much more distinctively modern and postmodern phenomenon that many more, scripts, so to speak, about how we live our lives, what we do actively then, as opposed to how we are subjected to power, are sort of internalized.
And the techniques are much more subtle. We're much less cognizant of it. But again, his critique is so all-encompassing. It's almost too deep for its own good in terms of presenting anything viable with which, you say, how would I respond? I guess if he's right, I would respond, well, so be it. It's so totalizing in some sense that it truly does become unavoidable. And I think he himself, sort of toward the end of his life, I don't want to say lightened up, but started to recognize this and see that, these discourses within which we are trapped, it is like a Platonic cave within which we are enmeshed and cannot see beyond. That's just part of living in a culture, I think, for better and for worse.
Professor Spain.
So thanks for your papers, very interesting. I have to say I'm not convinced, persuaded yet by the various discussions that what's at stake in contemporary democracy is in fact tyranny, or the future is one of tyranny. In your paper you described, even if we grant arguendo that the description is right, a way in which we've become very servile. You refer to it as being oppression, would be a kind of self-oppression maybe, which is a curious kind of oppression. You'd have to grant maybe that you could coerce yourself, oppress yourself. It's not obviously right, but these concerns go back a long, long way. So even, liberals like Kant and Mill said that, in society you find people who are, quote, dumb domestic livestock, unquote, or people who behave like, quote, ape-like imitators, unquote. So, they were on board with some of this stuff. Now, as to whether, though, this generates a kind of tyranny, or the worry is that for the future of democracy, we might have a tyrant or a tyrannical form of governance, I still don't see why that's true. In fact, maybe one of the takeaway points might be that perhaps whatever we do have, it might not be tyranny, because after all, it would be tyranny run by whom? Who's going to be the one foreseeable, or the small group, the 30 tyrants or some such, who will exercise this kind of control or power over us? without already being part of the same kind of, curious, capitulated humanity that will become. And so I'm not convinced that tyranny is actually the future of democracy. It could be, but wouldn't it, to keep the concept useful, would it have to be a future in which, there was a seizure of power by some small group or some such, and maybe that's something that we should always be concerned about, but perhaps that's not where things are trending at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I am largely persuaded by what you say, or at least that's the prospect of what I bring up in the paper. It's interesting if you look at the history of, especially of modern political theory, the extent to which, talking about tyranny, the animal metaphors shift from humans as wolves or humans as lions, red in tooth and claw, to humans as barnyard animals, sheep, cow. I mean, Mill's ape is not a barnyard animal, but the effect is the same. And how there's this shift in the late 1800s to this different sort of, or I should say mid and early 1800s, this shift in animal metaphors when theorists want to talk about tyranny. But that's an interesting point. First of all, it goes back to Foucault, where even the power holders are subject to the power which they hold, and maybe that makes it in some sense less threatening. And to a point you raised earlier, which I wanted to respond to, is the extent to which we are subject to surveillance and potentially and there are power holders, people who oversee us. But again, we would want to ask, who are the tyrants in this situation? Is this constant surveillance we're under, are we controlled in any way, shape, or form? Does the government's palpable and obvious incompetence in many respects belie their power over us? Are we to fear the head of Homeland Security, people who work for this kind of goes to Professor Muirhead's point, where if this is just this sort of free-floating power, and maybe it's such an expansive form of power that it's beyond anybody's grasp, to crunch these numbers, to control this data, to truly, as you said, every phone call is recorded. Well, that in and of itself may undermine the efficacy of the recording of those phone calls. And this is a problem the government's actually faced with these big data problems. And so to what degree, picking up on your question, to what degree should we be concerned with the extent to which we're being surveilled today, which again would bring us back to Foucault?
Professor Espada?
Yes, well, very briefly, thank you very much for your presentation, which I enjoyed immensely. But I have I mainly agree, but I have a question, actually. And that is, it seems to me that there is a difference between cultural uniformity or homogeneity, which I think you mainly describe, and political tyranny. I don't think the two things are actually the same. And the main difference, in a nutshell, I think, is on coercion. State coercion. Political tyranny has the power to coerce your behavior. Cultural uniformity does not have that power. Like you said, being self-coerced is a sort of strange idea to me. And Isaiah Berlin mentioned this in the two concepts of liberty. Being liberated from myself is something that I'm very skeptical about. So my point is there must be a difference, it seems to me, between cultural uniformity and political tyranny. So my point is, to give an example, you may live in a homogeneous culture, but if you live under the rule of law, you will be allowed to behave differently if you want. And different groups within civil society will be allowed to emerge spontaneously and have different behaviors. So as long as we can preserve the rule of law, and we have the key to oppose cultural uniformity. On the other hand, so that would be my point. So the real danger comes, I think, when a tutelary state, as Tocqueville described, emerges on behalf of equality and of the people, and expands beyond the limits imposed by the rule of law, and starts regulating everything alike in a similar manner, and compelling by coercion people to behave in the same manner. But I think this is different from having a society which has a sort of homogeneous culture, but it is limited by the rule of law and allows you or me or anyone to behave with. Anyway, to give an example, I mean, I don't bother much with Las Vegas. I've never been there. I don't intend to go there. And provided the law doesn't make it compulsory that I have to go to Las Vegas or that everyone has to be like Las Vegas, I really don't see much of a problem.
Well, just to respond quickly, and this goes back to this liberation from oneself. Well, that depends on the idea of there being a higher and a lower self. And the higher self, the intellectual self, the spirited self, the soul, being subject to the lower self. This is why I go back to Plato. And surely we've all experienced this, where we maybe even sort of know what's better for us, but we don't do it. This is why I bring up the food example, where we give in to our base desires, very often even despite ourselves, maybe not. In terms of, I think what you're talking about, what you're rejecting is what Mill called social tyranny, the tyranny of peer pressure. And Tocqueville talks about this a lot in Volume 1 of Democracy Again, where you're not compelled to do or not to do anything, but you simply sort of fall in line with those around you, maybe without even realizing it. And so it's not experienced as oppression, but you are not really choosing, you're not really determining, you're not really sovereign over your own thoughts and actions. And here I give the example, the best example I can think of would be something like peer pressure. You can think of particularly in high school. There's no law that tells all the kids they have to dress alike, look alike, talk, but boy, they sure do, and often not to the betterment of, and they'll, even to the extent of, well, again, can't get into everything today, but this idea of just following the crowd, following the greatest number. We saw this in this country in 2001, 2, 3, when going to war in Iraq, and there's no law there was a rule of law, freedom of speech, etc., but dissent was silenced. The gravity of opinion was silenced, even to the point famously of, I forget her name now, but that she was a singer in a country music band, was literally had to leave the country. She criticized George W. Bush at the wrong time, the Dixie Chicks. The lead singer of that band said something about the lead up to war in Iraq, and this would be exactly Tocquevillian. Album sales bottomed out, popularity bottomed out, concerts were canceled. She had to go tour Europe because nobody in America wanted to hear her anymore.
Go back to the question of surveillance. The most intrusive, up to today, the most intrusive agency in the federal government has been the Internal Revenue Service, which knows a great deal about all of us. If you go back to the 18th century and you look at the period of the American Revolution, there's a real nervousness about direct taxation. There's a preference for things like tariffs as a way of taxing. The nervousness has to do with the intrusiveness of it, which is to say they're looking into the interstices of your lives. The Internal Revenue Service has almost always been abused. They were blackmailing senators and congressmen in the 1920s when the thing was brand new. It continued to be used in that way through the 30s and the 40s. Nixon famously tried to do so, and there's reason to think it's been done that way in recent years, which is to say that silence people by using those powers. Think what kind of power computers and the surveillance state provides now for blackmail, for making people nervous and getting them to shut up. Now, it's true you've got to use these computers to search, but they're really good. What they're capable of doing if they go at it, directed from above, is considerable. Now, I agree with you, there's a kind of fecklessness in everything that the American government does. If you've ever dealt with the Social Security Administration, you hold your head in your hands about the complexity of working your way through the administrative protocols, all of which could be done online like that if they actually had their act together in the way that, say, Delta Airlines does. Nonetheless, if there's a will at the top, and I'm talking about the executive, to get this sort of thing done, and there are not severe checks so that this would be fatal to said executive, it will be done. People like to get reelected, and they often pull out all stops in order to get themselves reelected, or elected, or someone from their party elected in the first place. And the so-called impartial civil service has fairly often been willing to play ball. So I think the dangers are really very great.
And one wonders if these techniques were deployed, would they be unnoticed, unseen, and if we noticed them, saw them, would they be decried? Would somebody like Nixon lose office for it?
I think Professor Espada had a follow-up.
Yeah, so I'd just like to go back to this question about liberation of myself and oneself. I think the distinction that you've made between higher and lower is certainly very important and should not be replaced by the distinction between more and less. But I agree, I happen to agree with you, but I also think that this distinction is so important that it should not be allocated to political decisions. I mean, the distinction between higher and lower should be left to an ongoing conversation in civil society beyond politics, including civil institutions, churches, neighborhoods, what Edinburgh called the little platoons, and not centrally decided by political institutions. So again, what I'm saying is there is, I think, a crucial distinction between the sphere of civil society and culture in general, and the sphere of politics. And I don't think we should, identify the two, because then a real tyranny can emerge on behalf of the higher.
Which is certainly something Tocqueville would agree with. In fact, maybe his central point. Don't confuse politics with the state. Local politics, civil society, everything that happens in that sphere.
Comment on the two welfare states that you mentioned. The first thing that crossed my mind when you brought up those two categories of welfare state was the distinction that people like to draw between equality of opportunity and equality of condition. With your first welfare state need satisfaction being more the equality of condition, where the other welfare state's more freedom to do your projects, equality of opportunity. But if your highest value is some sort of telos of abstract equality, doesn't the distinction break down in operation? Think, for example, if we all agree here that we want to give the power to the state to level the playing field for everybody. All right, let's take that as a given. And we're going to start a race. All right, and Paquette has the starting gun in hand. And we have all the panelists here at the beginning of the starting race. And I sound the gun, and everybody's off in the race. Well, at a certain point, the race has to end. Paquette fires the gun again. And what does he see at the end of the race? Well, Sarah is in the lead. She has a history of, in the past, of running sprints. Paul is barely out of the game. Okay? And then suddenly the people observing this say, geez, that's not fair. We have to run the race again. And this time, Sarah's got to start with leg weights on. And somehow we got to give Paul a rocket boost. You see? The concern that I have is that the practical operation of this, when you have this abstract understanding of equality as the highest value, it becomes a formula for perpetual revolution, which benefits Juvenal's notion of power with a capital B. The beneficiary is always power, and it agglomerates to the center, and as a result, it leads to this tyranny, which Initially people with the best of intentions, given these welfare state opportunity, didn't want. That would be my comment. Maybe you have.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing I would say in response to that is that on the two models, the second model I described, the freedom enhancing one, I think that the primary value is in fact freedom rather than equality. And it's primarily concerned with providing people with enhanced capabilities and opportunities and not primarily committed to equality. So it's true it's a form of equality of opportunity, but the emphasis is more on the opportunity than the equality. And so I think the kind of thing that you would think of as classic to that kind of welfare state would be something like a stakeholder grant, something like that. So everyone is provided with something at the beginning, but then it's used to pursue your own projects, and there's a certain amount of risk involved, and the state doesn't guarantee that at the end of the race, so to speak, everyone ends up at the equal starting place again. I think education is another good way of thinking about that model of the welfare state. And just the one other thing I'd add in response to what Paul was saying earlier is that if you think about people who are provided with a fair amount of privilege in their own lives through their parents, either through inheritance, sometimes end up very wealthy, or just through parents providing for their education and all of these things at the beginning of their lives, some of them do, yes, become, just Veblen's kind of leisure society, and, they engage in silly pleasures, but some of them go on to do great things. And so we can expect this kind of variation between people who prefer servile pleasures and people who prefer really great projects and strong ambitions, and that the fact that you were given something at the beginning to ensure that you did in fact have real opportunity, I don't think that there's evidence that necessarily leads to people engaging in only the lower pleasures or in, turning to drugs and television or something like that.
I would just ask and follow up, when we think about society, why do we want to necessarily defer to this capitalist image of society as a race of all against all? I mean, that you're starting from an image of how we live in society as essentially a race, which is maybe not entirely necessary, or captures those things we should be or are most concerned with. Why do we have to envision things as a race with a starting gun where we're all trying to defeat one another on the way to something at the end?
So, Professor Clark had her hand up. Do you want to?
I was just wondering if you could say something about the Wallen part of your paper that you didn't get a chance to present that Julie responded to briefly. I mean, there does seem to be, to me anyway, something rather dated about the kind of Tocquevillian concerns about the rise of the welfare state, given the many ways in which the state seems to be at the mercy of economic powers and forces that have grown so rapidly. And if I were to be honest, I mean, if I had to really name my ultimate master, it wouldn't be the federal government, it would be my iPhone, right? I mean, in terms of really what is disciplining my, the details of my life as I now live it, having purchased one. So I was wondering if you could say something about these concerns that Wallen entertains about economic or corporate power as something that's expanded beyond the reach of state control.
In a lot of senses, I think that is rooted in Tocqueville. I just gave a talk out at AEI in Washington entitled Capitalism as a Road to Serfdom, where I think Tocqueville really recognizes this bourgeois, what we'd call capitalist middle stage as potentially leading toward, paving the way for this nanny welfare state. In any event, and then Wallen, I think in a lot of respects, picks this up. This is why he has such an affinity for Tocqueville. He radicalizes it, drastically, and Tocqueville has nothing to say about corporate state or anything like this. But simply put, Wallen is concerned that the entirety of the human world has been subject to this modern power drive, if we want to talk about it in theoretical terms, formulated by Machiavelli and Bacon and Hobbes. And simply put, human societies become a rendering plant for the generation and projection of power. And we, in a sort of Foucauldian sense, think explicitly and exclusively in economic terms. So I'll give you an example, which may resonate, where liberal arts education is rejected as a waste of money. Why in the world would you want your kid to go on and study philosophy or any of it? I'm not going to get a job out of that. The exclusive view we have is vocational, not liberal arts. Politics. What is politics about? Well, that's obvious. It's the economy, stupid. That's all we have to say to it. If you watch a presidential debate, you'll get questions about gas prices and questions about unemployment and questions about, very few questions about the good life, or very few, we can extrapolate from there. Society becomes simply a market for the exchange of, and so on and on and on, this pervasive logic of capitalism infiltrates and colonizes everything. It becomes simply the way we think. Tocqueville calls this an inverted totalitarianism, where rather than mobilizing militaristically for the cause of the state, we are held in a sort of perpetual mobility, causeless celebration in service of the economy. There's this relentless revolution quality to capitalism that constantly dislocates, disorients us, and we end up just adrift, just trying to survive, make money, so that we can buy and sell. We can go on from that, but this is his ultimate fear, is that what he calls economy simply takes over the entirety of human society. Society becomes nothing more than an economy, and we don't even see it happening. And so success becomes about something like having enough money to buy an iPhone.
We have time for just one more question, so here in the front.
And what is the fix here? The assumption is to compare very imperfect functioning of civil society, and the unstated assumption is that some sort of collective rational intervention on using the agency of government can set everything aright. Yet to act through government means to act in response to politics. Thus, you end up with interest group social predation driving the policies. So welfare benefits are not sent where they're needed, but where the votes are, or projects are undertaken under cover of some rationale because they benefit some important constituency. So the government failure aspect of it tends to get overlooked. So we tend to be comparing an imperfect existing civil society with an imaginary perfect society that we assume can be brought about, but the processes that bring it about are not feasible in a democracy.
Well, and this is Tocqueville's great fear, is that we're going to reduce politics to this systematized managerial administrative national politics. Then we'll have civil society. What's left out of this picture? The beautiful messiness of local politics, of local political participation, everything, and he would include something like the jury in this, everything from jury duty to the PTA meetings. The endless different forms of local politics is exactly what Tocqueville's afraid we're going to lose between civil society, this apolitical civil society, and the managerial state, administrative state.
All right, well, we're out of time, so I'm sure we can all linger around for a continued conversation and ongoing debate about the nature of the welfare state and the future of tyranny. So with that, close of the conference.
Thanks.
Jim.